Good afternoon. Thank you. My name is Maria Pike, and I am a member of City Gun Violence. I'm a City Gun Violence lead for Moms Demand Action, and a member of the Board of Directors for Chicago Survivors, member of the Illinois Latino Alliance, Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice, among others. Most importantly, I am the mother of Ricky Pike, who was shot multiple times on August 3rd, 2012, in Logan Square while trying to park in front of his new apartment. Ricky is and continues to be my guiding light. I, alongside many moms and advocates, have been working for years to find solutions for the root causes of gun violence and violence. COVID-19 has exposed many, including youth at risk and education, and we must seek this unique moment when resources are coming to work hard to address and solve those inequities in our communities. It is intolerable that we have reached almost 800 deaths this year. It is also unsustainable to keep demanding action but not being involved. We must be the nosy neighbors because your children are our children. The time is now to fully engage the ATF, the FBI, law enforcement, Congress, the judicial system to stop the illegal traffic of guns, straw purchasing, ghost guns, to make sure that people who should not have guns, like domestic abusers, suicidal citizens, and criminals, do not get access to guns. Responsible gun ownership must include responsible safekeeping of guns to prevent tragic losses and guns showing up in schools. Part of the puzzle for restoring the village we deserve is to make sure that the criminal justice system becomes restorative and not punitive, that we create spaces for second chances within the prison system and provide tools for returning citizens to become proud members of our community. We must also be vigilant and make sure that we elect judges who can truly reflect the sentiment of the law and its citizens. Whatever strides we can make, we must use fairness at all times. I love many members of the police force, and I agree that divesting from situations that are better covered by professionals is the right thing to do. Community engagement must start with them and us, one-on-one. All commanders and staff on the 25 districts must reflect the spirit of the consent decree and the efforts of the CAP forces within each district. Chicago Survivors, as a first crisis responder and provider of wraparound family service, is keenly aware that we all belong together, that we must seek truth and reconciliation and create safe spaces 24/7 if we are to achieve the health and safety we want for our clients, starting with gun violence and its complicated roots. Recognizing the needs of each one of our family units in efforts to provide them not only with grief and counseling services, but all services that will bring back their dignity and heal their own by working toward and owning their paths. I believe in watching what people and organizations do rather than what they say they do. We're happy to report that the Office of Public Safety, which now includes the Community Safety Coordination Center, the Department of Public Health, Office of Violence Reduction, etc., have been including stakeholders of our diverse communities to create task forces, community listening sessions, and being intentional about identifying credible messengers like survivors throughout the city. And why? Because as it is our case, as survivors, we are the experts on death in our streets and the ones who must continuously guard our families from street violence, even when we feel we are depleted. Investments in this year's efforts were $45 million, from $11 million in 2019, and 2021 will be a massive 400 million. We survivors can make change happen, and we are a standalone force that will never stop. Our marching orders come from the voices who are no longer here, and we're here to stay till justice and fairness happens. And without further ado, I have the distinct honor to introduce to our city mayor, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, a mother who promised she would help us, the unseen, and she's doing just that. Mayor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to talk to you about the state of public safety in Chicago. I know that people are scared and emotions around public safety, and specifically gun violence, including carjackings, are running high. And yes, we will end the year with homicides and shooting in a place that no one, including me, wants to see. I know that people for whom violence is a daily concern are particularly stressed, and that more recently, violence is creeping into other neighborhoods that have not historically been burdened by violent crime. As the mayor of the city, I want to assure you that from day one in my time as mayor, public safety has been, is, and will continue to be my highest priority. Keeping you safe is my priority. Not one of, but the first and primary priority. I wake every morning with this as my first concern, and I push myself every day and all involved to step up and do more and better, because we cannot continue to endure the level of violence that we are now experiencing. This is not an academic exercise for me. I feel the urgency every day. It is heart-wrenching to hear the cries of the survivors who have had a loved one felled by gun violence. There are no real words of true comfort or condolence to give mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers who are traumatized after they have lost a loved one, often in a brutal and frequently totally random way. Quote unquote senseless doesn't come close to describing or fully capturing the agony these families experience and the burdens they are now carrying. And for those families that were already suffering and burdened before the violence came to their doors, what we often see is that families and individuals start to unravel when the violence hits them. I carry the echoes and sobs and deep despair of those victims and survivors with me every day. I will never forget them, because we owe them our unrelenting commitment to not just find, prosecute, and incarcerate the perpetrators of the violence against them, but to proactively and relentlessly bring peace to our city once and for all, so no one else has to suffer like they are. And that is precisely what we have and will continue to do. I also recognize, as all of us must, that violence and crime are the manifestations of deeper problems. They are the offspring of poverty and neglect and the psychological trauma that comes with it. It is the kind of poverty and neglect that too many communities, like Garfield Park and others on the south and the west sides of the city, have endured for decades. I have and I will commit every bit of law enforcement muscle to fighting this fight. But I also know that lasting peace and safety will only come to the city when the underlying root causes of violence and crime are addressed once and for all. As a city and a society, we have the capacity and capability and obligation to do both: increase law enforcement and address these root causes. They are not mutually excluded. We must do both. I think it is important to share with you some context in which this fight is taking place. Nationally, almost every major and mid-sized city in this country is experiencing similar challenges with violence at the same time. New York will end the year up in homicides and shooting, and so will Los Angeles. Cities like Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, St. Louis, Denver, and even cities that rarely experience crime, like Austin, Texas, all of us, for the last 2 years, have been experiencing historic highs in gun violence that is tearing all of us and our residents apart. I fully recognize that it is cold comfort to the victims and survivors here in Chicago and our residents who live with this fear that we are part of a national crime wave. I get that. But this national context is important because it gives us opportunities to not only share best practices, but also to partner with others to address this problem so many cities are experiencing at the same time. I want you to be clear-eyed and recognize that there are no simple or easy, quick solutions to the challenges we are facing. The problems are multidimensional and decades in the making. And if the solutions were easy, we would have already executed on them. But we must do better, and immediately and in the short term, to take back control from the violent criminals who are preying upon us and making all of us less safe. There is no doubt that our common enemies are illegal guns and the violent people and gang members who use them without any regard for the sanctity of our lives, the precious lives of our children, our youth, our elders, and other innocents. Our city is simply awash in illegal guns, and sadly, has been for years. There are many reasons for this that set us apart from other cities in the country. And the resulting harm is showing up in our streets, in emergency rooms, in morgues, and funeral homes every day. And it is threatening not only our residents, but our police officers as well. Already this year, 69 police officers have been shot at or shot alone, the most in almost a decade. And this includes Ella French, who, as we all know, paid the ultimate price when she was killed in the line of duty. Ladies and gentlemen, this must end. To address this problem of the volume of illegal guns, the Chicago Police Department has reinvigorated dedicated gun teams and continues to lean into our partnership with the ATF and other federal, state, and county law enforcement and federal prosecutors. CPD are seizing guns, systematically debriefing arrestees to find the source of the guns, running traces, signing up confidential informants, and doing everything possible to be proactive in this fight. And this work is paying dividends. The CPD is on track to seize 12,000 illegal firearms off the streets of our city this year, which will be another record, topping last year's record of just over 1,100 guns seized, 11,100 guns seized last year. And again, the CPD will seize more illegal firearms off our streets than New York or LA combined. This is very dangerous work, as Ella French's murder made plain. Despite the danger to themselves, our officers, the gun teams, district patrol officers, and others have been heroic and continuing to take these weapons of destruction off the streets. These gun teams have also been very active in seizing expired firearms owners' identification or FOID cards and guns from individuals in Chicago who no longer can legally possess firearms. Year to date, the CPD has recovered over 400 FOID cards, and the CPD has also traced over 20,000 guns. This work is important and another vital tool in keeping our streets safe from illegal guns. But more can and must be done. That requires additional resources and help from our federal partners. CPD always needs and works with partners at all levels. And I must again publicly thank the U.S. Attorney's Office, federal law enforcement agencies like the ATF, DEA, FBI, and others, the state police led by Director Brendan Kelly, and the Sheriff's Department led by Tom Dart, and particularly the Sheriff's Police led by former CPD Deputy Chief Leo Schmitz. Their assistance has been invaluable. Despite all these efforts by the CPD and its various law enforcement partners, illegal guns continue to be readily available in Chicago. Now, you know, we have no gun stores in Chicago. We know that the guns come from elsewhere, across the border, from Indiana and other states, sold on marketplaces like Facebook and other social media platforms, and through the use of straw purchasers. We must shut these sources of illegal guns, shut them down, because they are bringing devastating harm to our city. That is precisely why, for example, earlier this year, our law department partnered with Everytown Law to sue West Forth Sports, Inc., a gun dealer in Northwest Indiana. We brought this lawsuit because West Forth repeatedly sold guns to straw purchasers, which resulted in West Forth being the top out-of-state supplier of crime guns recovered by CPD. We will not rest until we get the court to hold West Forth accountable for the harm that it has done in our city. The flow of illegal guns over our borders continues, though, to be a problem, even in the absence of federal movement on common sense gun control measures like universal background checks. The federal government remains uniquely qualified to help cities like Chicago address the scourge of gun violence. Now, over the summer, President Biden instituted a comprehensive strategy on gun crime, including a multi-agency strike force in Chicago and other cities. That renewed focus from the federal government was more than welcome and helpful, and has resulted in enhanced collaboration with the ATF and led to more police officers being task force officers. But we must build on those efforts through additional help from the federal government. That's why I have formally asked the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, to, with all deliberate haste, detail ATF agents to Chicago for 6 months so that we can increase the number of gun investigations and seizures in Chicago. And with these agents, we also need increased federal prosecutors to handle the new cases that will be generated. My request includes additional prosecution resources as well. I've also asked to send additional federal marshals to Chicago to assist the sheriff and the CPD to find and bring to justice the thousands of individuals wanted on warrants for violating conditions of release and other court orders. We need these additional resources well in advance of next summer. As part of this request, I've also asked the Federal Department of Justice to convene multi-jurisdictional task forces to stop illegal gun trafficking across state lines from southern states like Mississippi, up the interstate, through Indiana, and over the border into our city of Chicago. Only the federal government has the resources and reach to make a meaningful dent in illegal gun trafficking across state lines. They must do more, and we are ready, willing, and able to work in further partnership in this crucial work. Now, I spoke about this need on my recent trip to Washington, D.C., and I will continue working and pressing our federal partners to make this happen. We must also address the rise in ghost guns. Ghost guns can be bought online by anyone with the means to pay. They have no serial numbers, are untraceable, and can be assembled at home. Last year, in 2020, CPD seized 130 ghost guns. This year, that number has increased to 444 ghost guns seized to date. And CPD believes that this is merely the tip of the iceberg. And to be clear, these are not just handguns. They are assault weapons, too. Ghost guns are an emerging danger, and we need to act now to stop their flow into Chicago and across our state. Just a few weeks ago, for example, Chinatown resident Woom Sing Si lost his life to a perpetrator who used a ghost gun. That's why we will be working with our partners in Springfield to pass legislation that addresses this growing menace. I want to remind you that anyone who provides information about the location of illegal guns that leads to seizure and prosecution will be eligible to receive up to $15,000. We have $1 million set aside for this purpose, and we are serious about this, and we need your help. I said that the common enemy is not just illegal guns, but the violent criminals and gangs that use them. Right now, today, there are simply too many violent people walking our streets and wreaking havoc in our neighborhoods. You have heard me and Superintendent Brown talk about the issue of the number of violent, dangerous people out on electronic monitoring. I know no one believes that our communities are safer if murderers, attempted murderers, rapists, carjackers are placed on electronic monitoring and EM and are essentially free to go about their business after they are charged. Of course, they are entitled to a presumption of innocence and their day in court. Those rights are sacrosanct under our Constitution. I'm also not saying that nonviolent offenders or poor people should be held in custody pre-trial. I fundamentally do not believe that the Cook County Jail should be a debtor's prison. But if you are charged with killing someone, trying to kill someone, taking a vehicle at gunpoint, rape, or violence against someone in your home or theirs, for those people, I absolutely believe that they should be locked up pending trial because they are demonstrated, quote unquote, real and present threat to the physical safety of people and community as defined under Illinois state law. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, Cook County criminal judges have let almost 2,300 offenders with these charges back onto our streets, in our neighborhoods, on our blocks. It simply defies common sense. It's not safe, and this practice must be stopped immediately. We are in a crisis, and state law explicitly requires judges to consider community safety in making individualized bond decisions. The cumulative effect of having almost 2,300 violent, dangerous offenders on the streets has reached a tipping point. Too many of our neighborhoods are up for grabs. Too many people are being murdered by offenders out on electronic monitoring. In 2021 alone, for example, well over 50 people have been arrested for shooting or murder, all while on electronic monitoring. This includes the shooter of 7-year-old Jaslyn Adams, who was eventually arrested while wearing an ankle bracelet. How many more have to die before there's an end to this dangerous practice of letting violent, dangerous offenders out into the very communities in which they are alleged to have caused harm, often without meaningful supervision or in the absence of any meaningful interventions? Our residents, and particularly our victims and survivors, are entitled to live in peace and without fear of retaliation. And those very individuals themselves become targets for retaliation and street justice. The bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, is that the Cook County Criminal Court's current practices around electronic monitoring and violent, dangerous offenders makes our residents less safe, totally erodes confidence in the criminal justice system, and is a slap in the face to victims and survivors, and sets those violent offenders up for possible retaliatory street justice. Electronic monitoring was supposed to be paired with community supervision, and primarily for nonviolent offenders. In Cook County, there's virtually no supervision, nor any mandated community interventions. The Cook County electronic monitoring system is fundamentally broken in a way that is making our city unsafe. The county courts need to get the balance back and reserve electronic monitoring for only nonviolent offenders. But until that time happens, I am calling for an immediate moratorium on electronic monitoring for offenders where the lead charge is murder, attempted murder, aggravated gun possession, felons in possession, sex crimes, illegal gun possession, vehicular hijacking, carjacking, kidnapping, or attempted kidnapping, or other crimes of violence. I will be sending a formal request to the Chief Judge, Tim Evans, the criminal court presiding judge, and presiding judge responsible for pretrial release, demanding that this moratorium be put into place. Now let's be clear. This is not about finger pointing or shifting blame. We all have a role to play, and we all must be accountable. Further, we need to work in concert with our county partners, and I have repeatedly demonstrated my commitment to doing just that. There are many issues on which we can and we must collaborate. But for well over a year, the superintendent and I have been raising red flags about the EM program directly with our county partners without any changes. The pre-COVID EM numbers were around 1,200. The overall number now is about 3,400, with this category of violent, dangerous criminals accounting for much of this increase. The time for talk is over. We need concrete and definitive steps to be taken. We are all accountable and need to accept that responsibility. And as a city, we cannot make progress on combating violence in our neighborhoods if the county is not our partner in this work. It is the county, not the city, that controls the criminal justice system in Cook County, and the courts have exclusive jurisdiction over electronic monitoring decisions. I look forward to working with them to change this trajectory around and do whatever is necessary to protect our residents. Now let's talk about our fight against gangs. We also need to continue striking consistently hard blows against gangs in our city. Not only are gangs a major source of violence in our neighborhoods, they prey upon our most vulnerable residents. I've spoken to residents all over the city, like a group of moms in Little Village who told me recently that they literally live in daily fear of gangs in their neighborhoods. Also, in too many neighborhoods, gangs are targeting young boys with promises of wealth and an easy life, a sense of purpose and belonging. These promises can be and are very seductive to vulnerable children. Gangs are also exploiting those who are vulnerable to drug addiction, with increasingly lethal drugs laced with deadly cutting agents like fentanyl. In 2020, there were 1,300 opioid-related deaths in Cook County, a 50% increase over 2019. And while the final numbers are not in for 2021, deaths from opioid overdoses continue to be a significant problem, particularly in neighborhoods like the one that we are in, Garfield Park. No gang member in the city should ever rest easy. And people must also not shield them. We need to bring them to justice. As Father Mike has said, our faith must overcome our fears. There are people in our city right now who know the identity of shooters who have killed or harmed. I understand the fear, but I also must beg you, on behalf of the victims and survivors, to come forward. We need you to break your silence. I also know from my own experience as a former federal prosecutor and a defense attorney that there are many young people in the life that want out. And for those people, we need to extend our hands and give them an off-ramp. That's in part why we have invested so heavily in street outreach. One of the great values of the individuals who work in the streets is their ability to reach these young men and women and help them leave their often high-risk and violent lifestyles. We must continue to do everything we can to bring these young people home. We must also continue to do more for returning residents. As a person of faith, I believe in the power of redemption. And as mayor, I plan to provide even more focused support and resources so that people can, in fact, turn their lives around. Our FY22 budget does just that. That is why we are working to continue coordination of resources for returning residents, have created a first-ever mayor's office coordinator, all with a goal of making Chicago the second chance capital of the United States. But for the hardened criminals, we just have to be unrelenting to hold them accountable and make public examples so that we can hopefully deter other crimes before they happen. And here again, CPD has stepped up its fight against gangs. To date, the CPD, along with other law enforcement partners, has seized drugs with a street value of over $442 million. That's almost $500 million. And the CPD has also seized almost $27 million in U.S. currency related to narcotics trafficking. These seizures represent the highest amounts in drugs and currency seized in recent years. And we need to keep our foot on the gas. That's why I will press the City Council to debate and then pass the Victims' Justice Ordinance. Gangs are violent and dangerous and ruthless. They do not care who they hurt in their quest for money and territory. And we need not just seize their cash, but their assets as well. We need to take away the profit motive by depriving them of the blood money, along with locking them up. This will not be the rightfully discredited forfeiture policy and strategy of the 1990s. It's quite different. We will go after the leaders of the gangs, the shot callers and the ones who overwhelmingly profit from the carnage that's happening in our streets. We will go into court before a judge with a civil lawsuit where we will have the burden of proving that particular assets, cars, properties, businesses, are in fact the proceeds of gang activity. The defendants will be represented, and like in any civil case, a judge will determine if we have proved our case. And when we do, we will dedicate a portion of the proceeds to support victims, witnesses, and survivors in Chicago. In addition, the CPD will expand the number of officers committed to investigating gang, as well as dramatically increase the number of homicide detectives and reduce the current caseload for these detectives. Our homicide clearance rate is currently at 48%, which is up from the embarrassingly low 28% just a few years back in 2016. This is improved, but not nearly good enough. We need to hit 60% or higher in 2022 by increasing the resources devoted to homicides investigations, lowering caseloads, and continuing to build community trust, because we can't do it without partnership with the community. Additionally, the CPD must hold itself accountable for consistent improvement. To be clear, CPD detectives have solved more homicides this year, 374 and counting, than in any year in the last 19 years. We must build on that progress in 2022. We will also dramatically expand the reach of cameras with license plate readers. This technology is a game changer. It was key to quickly solving the murder of Xiaosheng Dennis Zhang, the University of Chicago alumna, a mere 2 days after he was killed. LPR technology has played a prominent role in assisting detectives in solving other homicides, violent crimes, carjacking, and more. We will substantially expand our network of cameras and our LPR technology in public spaces to better protect our city. Another significant tool that we have stood up is our Community Safety Coordination Center. We announced this initiative back in August 2021. We took a page from our success during COVID, when the whole of government mobilized to provide the resources needed during the height of that crisis. And the racial Equity Rapid Response Team showed us that we could not adequately respond without sitting at the table with those most impacted to develop and implement strategies to bend COVID's death curve. Now, violent crime is not the same as COVID, but the lessons learned around collaboration, coordination, community engagement, and how best to deploy resources and interventions do apply to the fight for public safety. The CSCC right now is mobilizing the city's resources to increase safety in communities most impacted by violence, following the lead of community leaders and organizations that have been fighting this fight on the ground day in and day out for years. The CSCC is about coordination, collaboration, and using data to target resources where they are most needed and to fill gaps so that we are reaching people and communities most in need when they need it. The CSCC is the only such non-law enforcement municipal public safety tool of its kind in the country. It brings all of the elements of city government together in the same physical space so that our hardest hit communities are able to receive coordinated resources. The CSCC has the potential, paired with proactive constitutional policing, to be a game changer for our city. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you hear that we have been aggressively executing on a comprehensive plan, but no doubt we will end the year far short of the expectation that we all had when the year began. That is a great disappointment to me personally, the superintendent, and truly all involved. No excuses. We must do better. We have taken stock, analyzed the data, and we will be making the necessary changes going into the new year. But rest assured, none of us will rest until we bring peace to this city. Now, I've talked at length about two of our common enemies: illegal guns and the violent, dangerous people who use them against our residents. But we have another common enemy, and it is poverty and neglect. I often say this because I believe it to be true. Neglect of people and places is simply not cost-free. Many of the communities that are most plagued by violent crime also have high incidences of poverty, high unemployment, homelessness, drug addiction, and other ills that tear apart at the fabric of community. This is why we held the first of its kind Poverty Summit in Chicago in February of 2020, right before COVID hit, as it turned out. We pledged then to eliminate poverty in a generation. The devastating impact of COVID on these poor and suffering communities made plain that we must accelerate our efforts, and we have. Over the years, we have literally spent billions of dollars in a law enforcement first and only strategy, and barely moving the needle in making these same communities safer. Law enforcement is key, but it cannot be the only tool we used. Let's look at the history. The spiking violent crime that we are now experiencing, we've seen this cycle before. In the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s during the crack epidemic, we've seen these spikes and troughs repeated over and over again, but never any extended period of safety and peace. The root causes were always poverty and neglect. But we historically always resorted to the blunt and often brutal tools of significant, overwhelming police force and mass arrest. We rarely, if ever, use data-driven, targeted strategies. The focus was not on root causes. And where did we end up? Right back in the same old cycle again. I believe that if we truly want to end the cycle of community violence once and for all, aside from holding violent and dangerous people accountable, we must get at the root causes of violence. Ladies and gentlemen, decades of futility have proven that we simply cannot just arrest our way out of this problem. We can and we must invest our way out of this problem. You see, if a child grows up seeing little to no opportunity around them, no positive adult role models, and the allure of the streets continues to speak to him like that siren song of lore, the child becomes a young person growing up without hope and believing his destiny is preordained. We have to fundamentally and permanently disrupt the pipeline of young men lured to the streets and show them, not just tell them, from the earliest stages of life that their lives have value, that we will be that village for them and that their families and that their destinies are not preordained to mine someone's corner spot or jail or an early death. As we reinforce that their lives have value, we must also be clear that their neighbors' lives have value. Basic rules and agreements about how to live in a community with community norms cannot be lost. We must teach our children love and compassion, empathy, and that if you want something, hard work and sacrifice is how you get it. We cannot tolerate people taking what is not theirs. We need a value statement of love for all of our children, regardless of the circumstances into which they were born. We must ensure that we truly have their backs. Is this some radical statement? No. It's in keeping with the long tradition in our city, stretching back to the days of Jane Addams and before. Our more modern day examples like the United Way, Boys and Girls Club, Catholic Charities, MyAFA, just to name a few. We have always shown our hearts and our values, and now more than ever, we need to scale it up in a coordinated, data-driven fashion. This is precisely why our FY22 budget will make $1.2 billion in investments, in things like affordable housing, economic development, mental health support, addiction treatments, support for our young people, and more. That is why Invest Southwest, our signature economic development initiative, is so important. That is why we will use our ARP dollars, the federal infrastructure monies, and our capital plan and other resources to build a city that is truly equitable and inclusive for every person in every neighborhood. Our city needs to heal. Our city needs to heal. And we cannot get there unless we invest in our people, all of them. Some may not immediately associate these investments with public safety tools, but they are. Investing in people and places uplifts lives, stabilizes families, and makes neighborhoods vibrant and, importantly, safe. It will require the whole of city government, from public health and social services, schools, parks, libraries, and more. It will require continuing and scaling our ongoing work of engagement with essential community stakeholders like faith leaders, social services, and healthcare organizations, block clubs, and just plain old ordinary folk of goodwill who love their neighborhoods, love their city, and want to roll up their sleeves in service of a mission that is larger and greater than individual pursuits. We must continue to use data-driven strategies through the CSCC and listen to residents about their needs. It will require businesses and philanthropic communities to do more. Ladies and gentlemen, we need you. No one mayor or police superintendent can do this alone. We need partners and partnerships that are broad and deep. And I'm not talking just about monetary investments, although those are important. I'm also talking about investing your time and talent to the most urgent and noble cause of our lives. We need an army of volunteers to serve. In the short term, we must all invest our resources in the people and places that call our city home, while laying the groundwork for anti-poverty measures and community investments to tackle the root causes of violence in the long term. In other words, there's immediate work to be done, and we need every one of you. Let me close with this. For me as a Chicagoan, not just as a mayor, there's no greater or higher calling than to be relentless in our shared mission to bring peace to our communities. I need all of you to be on this journey with me. If you are a person of faith, when you humble yourself and ask for God's grace, ask for blessings for your neighbors too, whether you know them or not. We all need grace and respite from the trials and tribulations of today and the last 20 months. As difficult as it's been, and it's been very difficult at times, as the dawn of a new year approaches, I always take this time to reflect and dream about what a new year will bring. I have tremendous hope in my heart, in part because you have shown me again and again your own resiliency and that quintessential Chicago toughness. There is no problem that we cannot tackle if we lock arms and we do it together. So my friends, my family, my fellow Chicagoans, with renewed faith and confidence and a commitment to address our immediate and long-term challenges around public safety, we cannot forget that Chicago remains and will always be a great city, a city we love, a city we call home. God bless you all, and happy holidays. It's now my pleasure. You can clap for that. It's now my pleasure to ask TJ Crawford, the Executive Director of Garfield Wellness Collaborative, to come and say a few words. For those of you who don't know, TJ is such a moral force for good, a man who cares deeply about his community, who has pushed us, and I hope will continue to do the right thing for the right reasons, for the people in this community. He's a city asset and treasure. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you TJ Crawford.
Can we give Mayor Lori Lightfoot a round of applause, please? Can we give her a little bit louder round of applause? I asked that the third part of her speech really kind of touched into what I feel in my spirit, what I know, what informs the work that I do. And I'm the type of guy who doesn't like to repeat which has already been said, right? So you said it, I don't have to say it. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people will hear truth, say truth, but they won't receive truth. They won't adopt truth. They won't act on truth. Instead, they choose to see a world through the lens of their own truth and operate and move in ways that serves their own self-interest. So I'm gonna utilize this time to tell a story, right? Because oftentimes all of what we do is based on the stories that we've been told. And I know y'all gave me like 5 to 7 minutes. I might go 60 seconds over. Just 60 though. I'm gonna try to stick to this box, right? So my name is TJ Crawford. I'm the Executive Director of the Garfield Park Right to Wellness Collaborative. We call ourselves the Right to Wellness because we want to move as a collective from one state of health to a better state of health. It's a rites of passage, a collective experience where we go from a certain place of maturity and hopefully evolve to a better place of maturity. That then in turn allows us to turn around and be greater assets, greater tools, greater members of the families and the communities in which we're a part of. We operate off of a concept called black culture wellness, which if you take the black off is just culture wellness, which says that the unique, authentic expression, however it's seen, music, dance, clothes, institutions, edifices, policies, police, schools, all of that. The unique, authentic expression of the values and principles self-determined by a community will lend to the long-term health and well-being of that community. In Garfield Park, where we're 94% African American, we feel extra comfortable in saying black culture wellness. So put the black in front of all of that self-determination, values, and principles, and we feel that the authentic expression of who we are as we define ourselves will lend to our long-term health and well-being. With that as a framework, let me tell this little story, right? Last time I gave a speech with the mayor, I started with a rap. I'm not gonna rap today, but I'm gonna give you a line, right? The line says, I live in a world so cold that the snow keeps melting. I'm gonna say it one more time, Brother Milton. I live in a world so cold that the snow keeps melting. When you operate from a place of lack, you have a tendency to see any and everyone that seems different to you as a threat. You might perceive them as a threat to your well-being, someone who may attempt to take something away from you, including in the worst case scenarios, our lives, or we may see them as competitors poised to challenge our pursuit of the cherished and necessary resources that we know are essential to our livelihood and well-being. I suppose that was the case for early American settlers, early Chicago settlers in particularly, Irish, Italian, Poles, Germans, African Americans, who in the late 1800s and 1900s, when Irish immigrants and others began to feel the presence of a growing African American population who had begun to make their way to the city during the Great Migration. I suppose their feelings were the same for any and everybody that they perceived as a threat, as evidenced by Chicago's early gang wars led by some of those that I spoke of, who were fighting for their stake of a Chicago underworld because the above world was already occupied by persons who were related to their former overseas oppressor. I wonder though, as those in particular in this case, I'm talking about Irish and Italian immigrants who populated these ancestral grounds, right? The ancestral grounds that were once roamed in, I don't want to say controlled, but that were nurtured by the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi nations, who called Chicago before Chicago was called Chicago. I wonder if they knew or would have viewed these black Americans differently if that, instead of hearing stories of John Kinsey, they would have learned of the person that sold John Kinsey his home. Who was who? Jean Baptiste, right? I wonder if that information would have changed their outlook on the presence of these new Negroes who were moving into their town. I wonder if it would have impacted the thought of the young men and women who in 1919, after several years of increasing hostility, kicked off a race war that ended up killing 53 mostly African-American residents of the city of Chicago. Those Irish immigrants felt black folks were so much of a threat because of the story that they had been told. And they cherished their own well-being so much that instead of responding to an attack, they actually went on an offensive, right? They actually went into black communities, kidnapped, beat up, sometimes murdered, in a poverty-induced rage of their own, created by a reality that did not allow them to see the truth of what they were doing. One of the most prominent of those gangs was called the Hamburg Gang. Now that gang wouldn't necessarily be of any significance other than the fact that there was a 17-year-old Richard Daley that was a member of that gang who had been steeped in an ideology that allowed for those actions to take place in a way where, oh, it's okay, this is what happens, this is what we do, this is what those people deserve. The participation of that 17-year-old Richard Daley would normally be of no significance, but he grew up to become the boss of Chicago. And his son became the boss of Chicago. And as bosses, their personal and cultural philosophies passed on to them at an early age, created the lens from which they viewed the world and set the platform from which they wielded their power. One that seeped into every aspect of a city government that they rebuilt in a fashion that reflected themselves and the philosophies that they hold dear. So a police force that had the public motto of being there to serve and protect, and the black community meant to neutralize and imprison. This idea of neutralizing and imprison can be seen in how black communities have been policed for at least 70 years in this city. Police were legal terrorist organizations for many communities, black in particular, that were meant to keep black people in their place, meant to keep them in a box, where if they behaved according to a popular myth, they would be rewarded. But if they behaved in a way that contradicted those myths, they would, could, and normally were ostracized, oppressed, and even assassinated, which is evidenced by the tens of thousands of horror stories told by generations of black folks that have negatively been impacted by their interactions with police. If that wasn't enough, the ideas that drove a philosophy of governance from City Hall also permeated every other facet of life in Chicago, from real estate and housing, to education, to corporate participation, to lending, to transportation, to food access. There were very few examples of a system that was not an outright tool of oppression against many communities, but Chicago's black community in particular, except for the tools in which we created for ourselves. And even those tools were attacked and eventually eroded, not only by racism and prejudice, but by the ills that come along with the greed is good, crush all competition mindset that often comes from an ideology that says survival of the fittest. So after at least 100 years of a war on black existence, one that made the very basic experience of walking through your neighborhood a traumatic experience, one that constantly chipped away and eventually destroyed the family structure that black people were willing to traverse hundreds of miles for to keep intact, one that destroyed what was once known as the capital of black America because of Chicago's black community creativity and industry. After 100 years of attack, when we recognize the symptoms that come from what we now call complex PTSD. And when I say complex PTSD, I'm not talking about post. I'm talking about present, right? When complex PTSD symptoms like low self-esteem or extreme emotional dysfunction or relationship problems that often find themselves expressed in feelings of hopelessness or in an intense desire for revenge against those who have done them wrong, when we see the children of the mothers and fathers who have been shut out of society to the point where many feel the only option for them to make a dollar is to stand on the street corner selling themselves or weed or bags of pills or opioids or whatever else we see. When we see these people acting out of their hurt, the response and encouragement of many is to revert back to the same policies and procedures that were developed by an inferiority complex that was to label a whole race of people as subhuman and therefore not deserving the same basic respect that one would want for themselves. So tell me, when we recognize these truths and the harm that they have done, why would we think that reverting back to those ill-fated policies would bring us to a better truth and a better recognition and a better present today? Today, Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who I believe and know is a person who seeks to be better, who is an imperfect person who is on a path to be perfected, as she attempts to do something that approaches this city's self-inflicted problem for a more logical, rational, and truthful lens, she's criticized on the front page of the city's newspapers because it hasn't reduced crime at the rate of business and institutional stakeholders believe that it should. But very few of those businesses and institutional stakeholders are willing to honestly and truthfully reflect on the lens which we have viewed and operated in this world. Very few of them refuse to reflect on the harm that their participation has done and continues to do, and instead they seemingly endorse a tired, terrible, terroristic approach to a people who have been under constant attack for no other reason than being who they are. So when I reflect on that, actually, I meant to say that when I think about where we are today in this building, which was built, I think, in 1874, and it was designed under what they called the Spanish-American Baroque design and construction, derived from a combination of Native American and Moorish decorative influences, Moor meaning black. We have been taught that this is something that is separate. As a black man, I have been taught that this is something that is separate from who I am. But when I do the history, I recognize that the origins of this, the beginnings of this, actually come from Egyptian or Kemetic or Nubian construction and ideology. So when I sit here in this building where there's been a story that was told that did not include me, when I learn that it not only includes me, but it comes from people who I am birthed from, that gives me a different sense of who I am, a different sense of belief, a different sense of self-efficacy, a different sense of what I believe I can do and what I can achieve, not because it's a hope and a dream, but because it's already been done. So when I reflect on that, I no longer feel as if others, or I no longer feel envious of others who have been taught that they have done certain things. I no longer am put in a place where I feel I have a sense of lack, but when I recognize that we have birthed certain of these technologies and science that sustains, I feel and know that I have the ability collectively with this community to move forward in ways that we have been told which we cannot. I believe the only way that the plan that the mayor just announced will work is if we eradicate the inhumane lens through which we approach the people who live in communities like Garfield Park. If we refuse to operate in our truth, if we refuse to grow from our failures, if we continue to endorse the evidence-based nonsense so many of us have adopted as truth, we will have wasted far more than what we already have. When the snow has melted because of our cold, callous nature, there will be no path to redemption. We will have to stew in that which we have already created. So today I ask and I join the mayor as we move on a path that's better. I tell that story so that there is no misconception of how we got here, so we don't adopt mistakes of the past. Instead, we learn and we build upon these solutions for a better future. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be very brief because I know our mayor has an engagement that she needs to be at. I am Alderman Talia Farrell, Alderman in the 29th Ward, and I am the chairman of the City Council's Committee on Public Safety. Let me just take this opportunity for those who were not aware. This is the ward of Alderman Jason Nervin, my good friend and colleague, and let me welcome you to the 28th Ward. Let me also welcome my colleagues that have joined us this afternoon, Alderman Patrick Daley Thompson, Chairman Tunney, and I believe Alderman Derek Curtis has joined us as well. But let me take this opportunity very briefly to thank Mayor Lightfoot and Superintendent Brown for their continued leadership and continued commitment to the city of Chicago. As the mayor discussed public safety, she mentioned her continuing commitment to making public safety her number one priority. And I think as we move forward with some degree of success, I believe that we must continue to engage our public and the city to be involved in their communities and to continue to foster a strong alliance between the Chicago Police Department and its residents. And just as important, we have to provide resources to numerous of organizations that are working blocks day in and day out, making a difference in the lives of the residents of the city of Chicago. And as the mayor presented her most recent budget, it was taken into account with more than $85 million dedicated to violence prevention program and over $400 million to support strategies identified in our city, our safeties plan. Chicago must, in my opinion, become a gold standard in public safety. Our neighborhoods can't thrive when we don't feel safe in them. When we go to shop without fear, when we can sit down at our porches without fear, and when we can attend neighborhood schools without fear and walk the streets of Chicago without fear, then we will be the best Chicago that we can possibly be. Superintendent Brown, I'd like to thank the men and women of our Chicago Police Department who tirelessly give of themselves so that we can live in the best city in the United States of America. And the partnerships that you form with our local law enforcement, our federal law enforcement, and state law enforcement to ensure that this is a world-class city. Thank you so much, Superintendent, and thank you, Mayor.